Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. This is the Tuesday episode, which means it's our In Whitt's Words episode. Each week, I take a closer look at some of Kyle Whittingham's comments from his weekly press conference, pulling out the big takeaways and putting them into greater context for you as a Utah fan. So, what did Coach Whittingham share with us this week? He gave us 15 minutes at his press conference, also provided us with some pizza, which was great. Sounds like we're getting wings next week as well. So shout out to Coach Whittingham, the Utah staff up there for doing that for us. Appreciate it as a big man that loves food, loves pizza, loves wings. I greatly appreciate it. Probably greater than most. So, but on today's episode, going to dive into the QB2 talk with Bird Ficklin and the way that he performed against Cal Poly, Isaac Wilson, redshirting. What does it all mean? Going to talk about the running back by committee approach. I think it's an interesting conversation because a lot of Utah fans, we're conditioned to think that there needs to be a workhorse that emerges, and so we'll dive into that. Devon Dampier's progress and him doing a better job of protecting himself. We'll also do a deeper dive into that, and then also the defensive secondary. So let's get into it. Don't want to waste too much time. QB2. Let me pull up Whitt's comments here from his press conference. He was asked about whether there was any sort of change at QB2 and the backup role behind Devon Dampier. And here's what he had to say. As we talked last week, Isaac Wilson does have a redshirt year, so that combined with wanting to find out more about Bird in live situations led to what you've seen the last couple of weeks with Ficklin, getting mop-up duty against UCLA and then being the guy to take over for Dampier against Cal Poly. So, I think that's an interesting thing, right? Why would Utah want to redshirt Isaac Wilson? What's the point? What good does it do? And I think it's important to understand that, Isaac gained a lot of experience last year. Obviously, a good a good amount of experience. And was it a lot of good experience? No, it was tough. They were some hard lessons. And I think for Utah, you want to redshirt Isaac because that'll give him time in this system. He's a sophomore this year. And when you're talking about the future of this quarterback position, preserving a year for Isaac does you a lot of good because, we need to keep in mind that Devon Dampier is a junior. He has another year beyond this, and you want to have your quarterback situation in a good spot for that sort of transition. And if you can keep these guys on the roster, which is always tough, and we know that it's tough, I think that is, that's a great way to go about it. Now, look, with the way that Bird Ficklin performed against Cal Poly, there's a lot of excitement, and rightfully so. He looked fantastic. The way that the ball came off his hand drew the oohs and ahs of Utah fans and attendance. Obviously, his athleticism, it allowed Utah to continue to operate the offense in a similar fashion as they did with Dampier at the helm. And so, look, regardless of what ends up being the case, moving forward, I think Ficklin did a great job of setting the bar, right? Like that's where we're at now with Utah. And look, and obviously it was against Cal Poly. There's going to be much tougher competition, and we need to keep that perspective in mind, especially given the experience that Isaac gained last year against the Big 12 competition. That's going to be valuable. So, the way you're going about it, I think it's important to remember these guys have 4 games to utilize and to preserve a redshirt. And if you can redshirt both of them this year to preserve that year behind Dampier, that's going to be tremendous for you moving forward. Now, obviously, again, with the transfer portal, you never know, but you're doing what you can to set yourself up both, in the here and now, but also in the future. And I think that's a great approach. And when it comes to, the backup quarterback position, I think with what Bird Ficklin showed us, you feel better about what he's done. But I think we're all sort of curious about Isaac and what he looks like. And so, I think there would have been value in getting him on the field against Cal Poly, but that was not the decision they made. They figured it would be better for Ficklin to assume those opportunities, and rightfully so. He capitalized. So we'll see with this backup quarterback, with this backup spot. But I think Utah's in a good spot with the two of them. And regardless of what happens down the road, we've now seen Ficklin in action against Cal Poly, and he looked great and has generated a good amount of excitement for the future of that position. So, lot to learn about this group, perhaps moving forward. But I think, with Devon Dampier and sort of how they're approaching and protecting him, I think you feel good about Utah's quarterback position this season and moving forward. Now, the next thing that he brought up, and I'm going to bring in just some clips here, get these rolling while I'm chatting. Another thing that he talked about on Monday was the rushing attack. And Utah right now is currently eighth in the country in rushing yards per game at 279 yards through 2 games. So, he was asked about sort of what's going to be, the mode of operation here, right? With this running back room, Utah's had a great history of workhorses emerge. Zach Moss, Devontae Booker, John White, guys like that had a significant workload. But I think what we've seen so far is that workload being split up by, two primarily, and then Dampier factoring into that, and a number of other guys. Utah's had at least 8 guys with a rushing attempt through both games. And so I pulled up the wrong one there. But, when Whitt was asked about that, he kept it pretty simple. He said the bottom line is the overall output, and we've rushed for nearly 300 yards both games. And so we're getting what we need right now. And I think that is, above all else, that's what we want to hear when it comes to the running game. It's just the production at the end of the day. What is it? And Utah, again, like I said, currently 8th in the country in rushing yards per game at 279 yards. They're averaging over 5.5 yards a pop. And I think that's great. And so if you can get 5, 6, 7 guys involved in the rushing game, that's going to help you moving forward. And I think another thing here too, with Wayshawn and with the carry, it is a really formidable 1-2 punch. I've really enjoyed watching the carry and the way that he runs the ball between the tackles. And, he runs with good pace, good vision. He runs tough. He's always good for another extra yard or two after contact. And then with Wayshawn, we saw the explosiveness both in the passing game, and the run game. We saw that explosiveness. And I think he's still kind of adapting to this offense, getting used to it. And he's going to become more comfortable in this offense moving forward. And as he does that, I think it's going to be important for him to continue to be that sort of explosive big play guy for Utah. Obviously, that would be preferred. Duh. But I think this 1-2 punch and this sort of usage is a good thing where you're getting multiple guys involved, because it just creates more work for opponents to prepare for. And I think that is something that, when we talk about the offense last year, it was very simple to prepare for. There wasn't a lot on the plate. There weren't a number of different looks, weren't many players to prepare for. It was all, what we saw with that inside zone, very simple stuff to prepare for. So I think it's great. And I think too, this is what you should want to see, right? When it comes to Jason Beck and him calling his offense, right? There's always a great amount of talk around, is the offensive coordinator going to have full autonomy? Is he going to be able to call the plays and the offense that he wants? This sort of running back usage is an indication that Beck is in full control of the offense, because this is his track record. This is his MO. When you go back to what he did at New Mexico last year, it's multiple guys being involved in the run game. It's different looks. It's the jet sweeps. It's the counters. It's the read option stuff. All of that sort of speaks to Jason Beck being in full control. And I think that, above all else is a good thing and should be an encouraging thing for Utah fans. Now, to the guy at the helm, in speaking about the run game, Whittingham had this to say about Devon Dampier and sort of what he did best this week. Whittingham said, "It was good to see Devon do a good job of breaking out on some runs and avoiding hits. He did a much better job this week of staying out of harm's way than last week." And I think everybody is nodding their head. Yes, he did. You go back to that UCLA game. He had the long run on an option keeper, picked up 15, 17, 18 yards, whatever it was, and ran right into the cornerback. And it's just like, why? Why do you do that? Why? Devin, protect yourself, man. Just run out of bounds. But, to his credit, he did do a better job of protecting himself on the run. But also, too, I think this is really important to note is that Utah is doing a lot to protect him as well. So it's really benefited Devon Dampier and sort of his overall level of play. On Saturday, he finished 17 of 23 for 192 yards and 3 touchdowns, which was a career best. He did a better job protecting himself, running the ball. I think he only finished with a couple of rushing attempts in that game. And I think too, what we've seen through the first 2 games is that Utah has made it a big point of emphasis in protecting Dampier, the quarterback. We're seeing Utah use 6 and 7 man protections to protect him. And it's such a valuable tool when you can do that. You can have an extra lineman on the field. Many of you have asked about who is number 49. It's Solatoa Moyai, an offensive lineman. We've seen Keith Olson and him on the field at the same time as well. Utah's that's another thing that Beck utilized a lot of, was a 6th lineman at New Mexico last year. It was out of necessity a lot of times for New Mexico because that offensive line wasn't good. But for Utah this year, it's a weapon. It's a tool because this offensive line is so good. Obviously when you've got that 6th and 7th man offensive lineman on the field, we're typically seeing a lot of run plays. But there are moments with that 6th man being Solatoa Moyai where we're seeing 6-man protections with linemen. And so Devon's getting a lot of time in the pocket, and that creates stress for the defense. That creates conflict where they're continuing to drop into coverage, and it's creating those open opportunities, those open field opportunities for him to tuck it and run for 15 yards a pop, right? So I think that is something that Utah deserves credit for. They're putting their money where their mouth is and protecting Devon Dampier. It was something I wish we would have seen with Ludwig and Cam Rising, just dedicating an extra lineman, to add protection to him, because Cam was so good at, determining where to go with the ball, even in limited route combinations and guys out on the route pattern. I think regardless of last year, I think Utah is doing a better job of protecting Devon Dampier. They know that if they protect him this season, keep him upright all year long, they're going to have a really good chance to put together a pretty special season this year. So they're protecting him, and I think that's really important. What's been really interesting though is even with that extra protection, Devon Dampier, he hasn't been pressured a whole lot. But when he is pressured, he's performing really well. He's got, according to PFF, he's got his highest grade under pressure. He has an 80.8 offensive grade and an 82.2 passing grade. So how he's being graded in terms of as a passer, right? Where is he putting the ball? Where is he placing it? Under pressure, that's his highest grade. And I think that's really exceptional to be that sort of quarterback under pressure to perform at a higher level. It speaks to just Dampier and his ability to avoid pressure and make plays when pressured. And, you look at how he stacks up against other quarterbacks under pressure. He has the highest QB rating. He currently owns a 133.3 QB rating, which the next highest is Connor Wegman at 110.4. He throws 87.5% of his attempts, which he's only attempted 10 throws. Those are on target, and that is a significant difference between him, at the top of this list at 87.5% of his passes being on target. The next closest is Brendan Sorsby at 75% of his passes being on target. So, I think that's something to keep in mind, is that Utah is doing what they can to protect Devon, to provide that extra layer of protection, that extra lineman on the field at times. And it's not even always, a lineman. It's a tight end, it's a running back being utilized in these 6 and 7 man protections to give Dampier time in the pocket and put that stress on the defense. Now, at the same time, there's the other side to that coin, and that's been the lack of explosiveness. And this is something that Kyle talked about as well. I asked him about the progression of the passing game so far this season, and he said, that the passing game has been solid, but he also said, I think it's something that needs to continue to improve. I think it's off to a pretty good start, but not real explosive. And so to me, when you're dedicating a 6th and 7th man for protection, you're limiting your routes out in the pattern, right? And coverage is all a numbers game. And when you're outnumbered, when you're only sending 2 and 3 receivers out into the field, that makes it easy for defenses to cover those receivers, because it's just a numbers game. You've got 3-on-2 usually, and makes it tough for receivers to get separation, to look open. And I think this is important context to keep in mind when we're talking about the wide receivers specifically and the passing game. I think there's an easy way for Utah to create more looks down the field, and it's simply, tweaking some of these protection calls, going to more 5-man protections, getting your full allotment of receivers out into the pattern, right? There's easy things for Utah to do to create more stress on defenses in terms of, routes and receivers. I think what we saw last year with Devon Dampier, I saw this stat that he's only 1 of 6 on attempts of 20 yards down the field, which is a really low number. In terms of attempts, most Big 12 quarterbacks, I believe, are upwards of at least 10 attempts to this point. So to me, this is partly scheme, significant part, I should say, where you're dedicating an extra man or two for protection. And then, also it's just that Devon Dampier hasn't taken those shots. But when you go back to his numbers at New Mexico last year, he attempted, I think he had 18% of all his attempts were at least 20 yards down the field. So he ended up with 70 attempts on the season, completed 35% of those. And I think what we'll see over the next few weeks is that number, that attempt rate on throws deep down the field, we'll see that number grow and get inch closer to that 18%. Right now, I believe it's right around 12%. We'll see that number continue to grow as we move forward. But I think there's some easy things for Utah to do to create more opportunities down the field, to become more explosive. It starts with protection, getting more guys out into the pattern, and then just Devon just taking more shots. And I think we'll see that because that is what we saw from him last year. So yeah. And then the last thing here that Whittingham talked about was the defensive secondary. And I think coming out of that Cal Poly game, I think a lot of us, at the very least, had questions about the defensive secondary, given how it performed against a lesser opponent, right? A less talented opponent. And Whittingham provided what they identified as the core issue. He said it's poor eyes. And, when you're talking about Utah and the coverage that they like to play, eyes are important. So here's what Whittingham had to say. That's really the key. Disciplined eyes, particularly in man coverage. As soon as you start getting nosy and looking in the backfield, you're going to lose your guy. And I think that is exactly what the issue was for Utah on Saturday in allowing a couple of Cal Poly receivers to get behind them. Maybe there was a miscommunication in terms of what type of coverage they were in a couple of those. Guys slipped a handful of other times, but I think it all gets back to your fundamentals, your technique, and it all starts with your eyes, especially in man coverage, right? If you're not locked on your assignment and you start looking around, it's very easy to lose your footing, to lose your balance, and to be out of place. And so I think that is good to hear to hear Whittingham talk about what they identified as the core issue. And I think it's going to be important for them to continue to address that. That's got to be the major point of emphasis. You're going to face a tougher challenge against Wyoming. It's an offense that's been pretty productive so far. You'll get a tougher test this week because you've got to be performing at a really high level in that next week with Texas Tech coming to town. So I think it's going to be important. And one player that I'm interested in this week, he hasn't logged a snap so far this season. He hasn't been available, but Donovan Saunders is a guy that I'm curious to see, if he plays and how much he might play. He was the primary competition for Blake Cotton at that cornerback spot. And given what we saw this past weekend with the secondary, and look, now maybe they weren't all 100%. Kyle Whittingham specifically mentioned JJ Buchanan was under the weather. I've heard that a number of other players were also sick, some in that defensive secondary as well. And so, we need to give that group a little bit of grace, but that's no excuse, right? They've still got to go out. They've got to perform. But I'm curious to see what this defensive secondary looks like this weekend against Wyoming, right? What we saw against Cal Poly, we saw a lot of Snowden on the outside with Benny on the inside in the slot. We saw Scooby Davis and Blake Cotton at that other outside cornerback position as well. And so, if Donovan Saunders is healthy, if he's available and is going to play, where does he fit into all of this, right? What does this secondary look like with their full allotment of players, which I think we'll see this week. So Donovan Saunders is a guy that I'm curious about. And I think this would be a good week, an important week to get him on the field because of what you're going to see the following week against Texas Tech. So that's what I've got on today's episode. Pretty short, pretty simple, pretty light, but I hope that added context helps people with a number of different things, right? So obviously, again, getting back to Devon Dampier, love the efficiency. He's completing darn near 80% of his passes, which just is a remarkable improvement. It speaks to his decision-making. It speaks to, the time that he has in the pocket. He's making better decisions. The accuracy is there and that, but what we're going to need to see from him is an increase in attempts down the field, an increase in both the difficulty of throw. He's going to have to take some chances that he hasn't taken through the first two games because, eventually defenses are going to counter this Utah offense, and it's going to be important for Devon Dampier and the passing attack to take advantage of those adjustments and to counterpunch as well. So, it's going to be important for Dampier to continue to progress, continue to improve. Wide receivers certainly need to continue to make progress. Utah's got some weapons in that tight end room. Dallin Bentley has been really, really impressive through two games. He looks like the guy that, has been on the breakout watch list each of the last two seasons. He's looking like that guy because he's finally healthy. And I think you feel really good about that group. Again, like I mentioned just a little bit ago, JJ Buchanan, Kyle Whittingham said that he was under the weather, not himself. Where's he at with that sort of ailment? Is he going to be 100%? What can you get out of him this week? But that tight end group, you feel good about that group. Going to need more out of the receivers. But all in all, you feel good about Utah moving forward and have really improved their outlook. I think they're one of the top contenders in the Big 12 now. I don't think there's any question about that, but they've still got some questions to answer, and they're going to have to provide those answers in the very near future. Maybe it's this week, maybe it's next week, but they're going to have to answer some question marks around that wide receiver room, around the defensive secondary. But we've gotten some really crystal clear answers with what this offense is going to be, how it's centered on the run game, what sort of impact Devon Dampier provides, and I think Utah fans should feel really optimistic about Utah's potential this season. So that'll do it for me on today's episode. I'll be back at it tomorrow. I'm going to be talking with a Wyoming insider. His name's Cody. I'm blanking on his last name. So Cody, I apologize if you're listening to this, but excited to talk to Cody because he's followed this program really closely over the last couple of years. I was messaging him over the offseason, asking about, Justin Stevenson, and he provided a lot of great insight, not only on Justin, but on the Wyoming program itself. So I'm excited to talk to Cody. I'll do that. I'll be recording with him later today, and that'll be tomorrow's episode. So we're keeping the focus on Wyoming. Obviously, a lot of talk about Texas Tech, the 10 a.m. kickoff, potentially big noon kickoff show coming to Utah as well. A lot of talk, a lot of eyes on the future. We're staying locked in on Wyoming. We're focused on the Cowpokes, on the Cowboys. We'll be out there in Laramie. Excited to get out there this weekend with maybe some golf in the near future as well. But yeah, anyways, wrap it up for me. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Blockcast, signing off.